Good morning, and welcome to another Seize the Day. Trust you guys are waking up feeling refreshed and ready to begin a new day. Today is Monday, October the 30th, and we get an opportunity to spend another morning together. Glad to be back home. Yesterday was such a busy day at Bethany Church. We had baptisms across all of our campuses. Yesterday we had, I think, about 18 people being baptized at our Greenland campus, and um, we just put out a big celebration, and family, friends, everybody's invited. And it was really a great time. I'm so thankful for the hard work that all of our volunteers and everybody puts on. It really does make people feel welcome. So it was a great day yesterday. Glad to be back home, and just settling into a routine. One of the things that made it extra special this weekend is that all my boys were in town. They wanted to come for just to see their brother's baby, because my son Andrew and his wife Nadia, they live out in Oregon, and then my son Jake and Riley, they live out in Washington D.C. And so they came into town, and we were all together this weekend. Uh, they're leaving sometime tomorrow, so we get another day to spend with them. Um, some of you have been asking and praying for Riley's dad. Um, he's in the fourth day now, post his liver transplant. And there's still, a lot of concern just to make sure that his body is accepting this new liver. But he seems to be progressing, and some of the benchmarks that the physicians have for him, he's been meeting those. So we're just really praying that God would just do a really good thing, and just heal him and bring him back to strength, where all these days that he's had in the hospital will be a distant memory. So appreciate your prayers, and I'm sure for many of you, as you share those prayers on our feed in the mornings, um, I'm sure many people are praying. It's one of those disciplines that if we incorporate it into our life, it's amazing how God just begins to settle one's heart. And so I'm grateful to be on the receiving end of those prayers, and rest assured that we will do the same for all of those who go through some difficult moments. We are now in a series that we have called Turn Up the Volume. It's a study on the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, again, because we always have new people coming into our morning Bible studies. Deuteronomy is the fifth book in your Old Testament. It's part of the five books attributed to Moses. It comes a generation after Moses delivered the Israelites out of Egypt, where he brought them out of the land of slavery, where they had been enslaved for over 400 years. And that generation, they received the Ten Commandments. They received many of the decrees and laws that God had put together so that they would thrive in the land that they were going. Um, but they refused to do God's bidding, to do His will, and to accomplish His purposes. And all of those things were done so that it would go well for them. But despite all that God had done for them, they remained rebellious, and they didn't. And the consequence of that is that they never really entered into that promise. They wound up roaming around the desert for like 40 years. And the consequence of that is that now that next generation that was born out in this wilderness, they are the ones who are now going to grab hold of this mantle and fulfill and be instruments to fulfill the promise that God had made to them. And so that's what we find going on here in Deuteronomy. Moses is addressing the next generation. We have already, now that we're in Deuteronomy chapter 7, we are going to be turning a corner here in the book. The first part of this book was all about Moses addressing the past. Moses took him to the past in chapters 1 and 2, right? Taking them to the past of their recent history, and was bringing up the past as a warning for them not to repeat the same things that the previous generation had done, that their future could be so bright. And then you get to chapters like chapter 3, where Moses is reminding them of their present and how they had defeated two of the fiercest kings and kingdoms, and how because of God's anointing on them, they proved to be victorious. You might remember one of those kings was the king Og, who was 13 feet tall, and well, he had a bed that was 13 feet by 6 feet. That was a pretty big man, and so all of this is to remind them again, look, God is with you. You can accomplish the things that God is setting out before you. So don't hesitate. Well, then we get to chapter 4, and Moses takes off this hat of this leader and now becomes the teacher. And he's extolling the values of this covenant that God had given to them. He doesn't quite explain what that covenant is in chapter 4, but he extols its value. He's saying, listen, to be in covenant with God, to be in a relationship with God is going to go well with you, for your children. You're going to live long in the land. You're going to receive all these blessings. So by the time we get down to chapter 5 was when Moses gave them the 10 commandments. And I just want to reiterate this for you again, because those 10 commandments were given to a people who all they had known were wilderness wandering. That generation, they didn't experience firsthand the slavery in Egypt. But growing up in that household with parents who did and grandparents who did, no doubt that those experiences trickled down and became a part of the culture and the environment in which these Israelites found themselves. So how do you go from living this kind of nomadic slave kind of existence to all of a sudden embracing these new promises that God has for you? The closest example that I can think of is, how about if you win the lottery, but you win the lottery and you're not very wealthy at all. In fact, you're working day by day to make ends meet. And then all of a sudden you turn around and you win a couple of $100 million lottery. Well, on that day, you're ecstatic, right? You're like, I can't believe this. This is awesome. All those worries, concerns are behind me. Okay. But if you grew up hand to mouth, have you developed the disciplines of managing that kind of money? How are you going to begin to put boundaries around your life about what's good and what's appropriate? All you have to do is read the stories of those who won the lottery and see how it destroyed lives. It broke friendships. It tore families apart. Right? People wound up, living such reckless lives that it proved to be a curse more than a blessing. So you see, what I'm saying is, just because you have a lot now doesn't mean that you're prepared on how I am going to live my life out in the shadow of all these blessings. And that's where the 10 Commandments come in, because God knows He's bringing these people into a land that now He says they're going to have, like we saw in chapter 6, right? They're going to have vineyards that they didn't plant, houses they didn't build, wells they didn't dig, right? All of these blessings now, they're going to come and they're going to inherit. And for them to thrive in this land, God says, I want you to walk with me. I want you to be in covenant with me. Just like, when you if you've had the privilege of marrying your sweetheart, right? And now you're standing there before God and family and friends, and you make a vow of the heart to love and to cherish till death do us part. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health. To have and to hold. It's a vow, right? And when you're making that vow, you're at the beginning of this relationship, and where that goes and all the twists and turns, children, finances, health, all kinds of things that are going to, pile up in your history together. But if your marriage is strong, those vows, they become this binding element on how we are to deal with one another. And so what God is doing with Israel and with all of those now who call upon the name of the Lord, he's saying, listen, I'm giving you this manual. I want you and I to walk in covenant together. I want you to listen to these words so that together we promise to be able to do these things one for the other. And if you do, God says, I make a promise that you would live long in the land, that it will go well with you, that you will be blessed. And if you model this for your children and their children after them, it says, you will be blessed among all peoples. People will see that. They're going to want some of that. And you're going to have an opportunity then to be an ambassador for God and his kingdom. Can you hear in those early words of Moses, those words being echoed again in the life and ministry of Jesus? When Jesus says, hey, you are the salt of the earth. Don't lose your saltiness. You're the light of the world. Don't hide that light, but let it shine. So it gives light to the entire room. You're the city that's set on a hill. So let your good work so shine that men may see it and glorify your Father who is in heaven. You see, the blessings that we receive is always meant to be a blessing to others. That was the covenant that God made with Abraham, that his descendants would be blessed, and the consequence of that is that they would bless all the nations of the world. So here Moses is describing this covenant to the people, ready to begin this whole conquest of this land. And he's telling them, okay, but here are the guidelines. Here's this covenant that I want you to maintain with me. And for people who knew nothing but slavery, what does he tell them? You shall have, and living in Egypt where it was so filled with idolatry, he says, listen, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall make no idols. I don't want you to misrepresent me before the people, which is really important. Like, which says, I shall not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. It's not just curse words. It's saying that I'm misrepresenting God to the world. In other words, how about if I am making light of what God hates? How about if I hate what God loves? That's a misrepresentation. I'm making it out as if God is okay with this rebellion, but he's not. And I'm giving people a false understanding of who God is. And God's saying, my people shouldn't do that. I want you to know me and represent me out in the world. You're bearing my name. I want people to see that divine image in you. And then he goes on, right? And I want you to keep the Sabbath, because that Sabbath day was a realignment. That one day of the week where we remember to find rest in the one who has given us strength that we might go out and make wealth, families, posterity, right? The sun that shines, the rain that falls, right? The food that grows, like all of these things are reminders of God's watch care, even in the midst of a broken world. Because God's desire, right, was for everything to live in harmony. It was man's sin that brought all this, upheaval. But in the midst of this, God says, I'm not going to leave you. I'm not going to forsake you. But here are some rules, because that one day that you set aside where everyone rests, and as I mentioned in weeks past, the Israelites knew nothing of rest. They were slaves. They were just churned up and then spit out. Someone else will take your place. But God's saying, no, among my people, there needs to be a rest. Even the animals are going to rest on this day. Because God says, I want you to be spiritually aligned with me. So all those early commandments, you begin to see, boy, they are in such a juxtaposition to the life that they knew back in Egypt, and maybe were carrying with them. And then he says to a people who had no property, who had no rights, who had no real possessions, no real choices. They were mandated by their oppressors. And you might remember, right, even early on in the book of Exodus, when life in Egypt is being described, the Pharaoh is killing the male children of the Israelites so that they wouldn't increase in number. Yeah, like how do you live in that environment? Well, now God is saying to them, no, I'm going to bring you to this promised land. It's a land that flows with milk and honey. You're going to have property of your own. But this is how I want you to conduct yourselves towards me. But then he goes on and tells them, look, don't steal, don't murder, right? He says, don't commit adultery, don't steal, honor your father and mother, don't bear false witness, don't covet anything that belongs to your neighbor. And you begin to see now these are guardrails. This is a covenant now that we're saying, because I love God, I'm going to treat my neighbor in this fashion. And so Jesus comes along, and this is something that I want you to understand. That covenant is never going out of style. It's something that God, this is a covenant that he establishes with his people. And now he wants all of us to enter into that same kind of relationship with him, because it has a way of defining who we are with God. It gives us a sense of identity. And then it also begins to put a mandate on our shoulders about how we're supposed to treat others. Jesus would take those 10 commandments and narrow them down to 2. Love God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. He says, on these 2, all of the law hangs. So God's saying, like, everything that I've been commanding, all these stipulations, everything that I'm saying really boils down to loving me and loving your neighbor. And if you do that, you're walking in this covenant with God. There's a text that's found in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17 to 20. I mean, I'm sure you've heard this before, but this is early on as Jesus begins to demonstrate his authority in the words that he's speaking. He says this in Matthew chapter 5. He says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. See, when Jesus is talking about the law and the prophets, he's talking about this revelation that God has given. This is what Moses has been now giving over to his people. This is how far back it goes. Jesus says, all those things that God has given to us, right? He says, I don't want you to think that I have come to abolish all of that. It's not like God says, all right, that was good for that day, but now we live in a different day, so we're not going to do that anymore. I have this new truth that I'm going to give you. No, Jesus says, don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. So how do you think Jesus views this covenant that God has made with his people? You can see how he has elevated this now. He's saying this is going to be accomplished. And he says, and anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same, he says, will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. What is he saying? Like, our righteousness has to surpass the righteousness of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Well, what Jesus is going to go on, and we saw this in our study of Matthew, Jesus is telling them that the Pharisees, they were all about this strict legalization, right, of these laws. And they interpreted those laws in such a way that it brought great burdens on people. It was almost impossible It made this walk with God something onerous. It was just hard pressed. Is that what this walk with God is supposed to be about? I thought that there's supposed to be the fruit of God's Spirit in us, a fruit of love and joy and peace and patience, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, kindness, self-control. Yes, see, all these things is what begins to develop this life of God. And so, friends, what Jesus is saying to you and me is like, look, your walk with God can't just be a matter of checking boxes. It's got to come from a heart that's filled with love. When you love someone, how easy is it for you to do things for that person? Even when sometimes that person might be, maybe they're in a bad mood. They woke up with the mully grubs, right? You still love them. You still do for them. And if they're sick or they're down, you're going to do anything you can to try to make them well because you love them. So here God's saying, look, I want you to love me. I want you to love your neighbor. So it's going to mean that you're going to go over and above and not just, adhere to some strict interpretation of what you think this law is. So you look in the scriptures right after this passage in Matthew 5, and what do you read? What you read is Jesus saying to the people, he says, listen, you have heard that it was said, thou shalt not murder. Quoting the Old Testament, right? Quoting the Ten Commandments. And he says, but I say to you, if anyone is angry with his brother, he has killed him. He says, if you call him Raka or you fool, he says, you're in danger of the fires of hell. Like, why would you do that? Like, basically, what he's saying is your words have a way of killing people, of robbing them of this life that God has promised. And we know that because, listen, how many of us could remember in a nanosecond some hurtful things that people have said about you? They don't go away too easily, do they? If unfortunately you grew up in an environment that was not very affirming, boy, you still bear those scars with you, don't you? And you had an impression of yourself that maybe really wasn't true. But that constant barrage of verbal attacks, it just has a way of beating people down. You see what Jesus just did there? Jesus says, you have one interpretation of do not murder. But I'm telling you, God is looking at that in its fullest expression and saying, you're not to harm people here. Why would you do that? Why would you drag someone down? Why would you verbally assault them? It's the same as if you took their life. Now, don't you see how Jesus is now taking these commandments and just like exploding them? And now all of us are sitting here thinking, oh my gosh, like this is not just about a list of checking things off. This has everything to do with the motivation of your heart. Same thing like when he says, thou shalt not commit adultery. I could check the box that says, I've never done that. But Jesus says, yeah, but I tell you, if any man looks at a woman with lust in his heart, he's committed it already. Because see, now I'm living this duplistic life. Like inside of me, there's just this constant churning. God's saying, no, you have to bring all of those things to bear on me. There's freedom in that. So all of which to say now, if we're not careful, we begin to find ourselves giving definition to what it really means to serve God. We begin to come up with our little list of what it really means to submit to God's will. And sometimes we find it easier just to follow our way rather than to really begin to submit our wills to his, to be conformed more and more into the image of God. And then you add to that living in a culture that seeks to maintain, that mocks people who show any allegiance to God's word. It's easy to capitulate then. and we draw back, we if we're not careful, we're courting more of the applause of men, right? The approval of men than the applause of heaven. So chapter 7 in Deuteronomy is going to begin to show, what does it really mean then to love God? Because he has just given us this list of guidelines. And how does that look in real practice then? So when you say, hey, I love the Lord my God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength, what does that really mean? Because if we're not careful, we're going to come up with a definition of what that means, and it might fall way short of what God's desire for his people are. So this is going to be a really good week of trying to get a handle on really what does it mean to really walk with God, to be in covenant with God. We've just been given these commandments, but now what does that look like practically? And we're going to see that played out in the life of the Israelites. And then we'll draw some parallels about what that looks like in 2023. But I could tell you from Deuteronomy chapter 7, 8, 9, 10, you're going to see different aspects now of what it means to walk with God, to be in covenant with God. And I think these lessons, they'll have far-reaching implications for how we live in the future. So my friends, I'm going to stop here. I want to thank you for joining me this morning. I hope this little review of the commandments and what God is really trying to do with them is a little liberating for you. Can I just end with this? How do you go from living this life as the Israelites did and now stepping into this new life that God has promised? It becomes only possible when we're opening ourselves up now to this new identity that God is giving us, to laying hold of, these promises and allowing them to inform the way in which we live. And what was true for those Israelites in the past is true for us today. We have to start thinking differently. We have to see ourselves differently. We got to leave room for God to speak to us about, the present and the future. And as we lay hold of that truth, Jesus says it will set you free. So my friends, thank you so much for being a part of today. I trust that you go out, seize the day, remembering that God is good all the time. And Lord willing, we'll spend some more time again tomorrow. God bless.